Okay, so our final speaker today is Tessel Blom, who is a PhD student in the lab of Dr. Hinze Hogendorn at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences in the University of Melbourne. And she's going to discuss the time course of prediction formation and revision in human visual motion processing. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so we're moving a little bit away, but we're sticking with the little bit of the classification analysis bit. So yeah, I'll be talking about how we form in the time course of prediction formation and how we overcome prediction violations in the temporal domain. And the reason that we are interested in this in our lab is that because of neural transmission delays, because the transmission of sensory information, so any sensory information, but we are mainly focused on visual information, through the visual system simply takes time. And that means that any available sensory information that we have available is lagging behind the present moment. And this wouldn't necessarily be an issue if we weren't living in a dynamic environment. So you can imagine if things are moving or you have to catch a ball, knowing where that ball is, accurately being able to localize it, the object is a necessity in order to interact with it. And what's been proposed is that the extrapolation of a position of a moving object, so having past information on the trajectory and extrapolating it into the present moment, can help overcome this. And by doing that, these predictive mechanisms can actually effectively decrease the processing time that are associated with the processing of these objects. And this has been shown in neurophysiology research where in cats and macaques, where V1 just responds quicker to moving stimuli than to stationary stimuli. And it's also been shown in humans using EEG. So the question that this project tried to answer is how much information about a motion trajectory is required to see a latency advantage, and where along the visual hierarchy does this latency advantage emerge? So for which neural representation can we see this latency advantage? And this latency advantage, what I mean with that is that the visual system just responds quicker to a predictable stimulus than it does to an unpredictable stimulus. And to look at that, we had a very simple paradigm. So we just had this apparent motion sequence where we had this wedge. I don't know if this translates well over Zoom, but what you see is a wedge that moves around fixation. It has 8 positions. And because we present it every 100 milliseconds, you get this apparent motion illusion. And what we then did is that we collected EEG while participants looked at this stimulus move around, and we trained LDA classifiers. So we did multivariate pattern analysis, where we looked how can we train these classifiers to learn to distinguish the location of this stimulus. And we did that in a pairwise fashion. So you train position 1 versus 2, and you do that in all ways. And what we found that, yeah, indeed, our classifiers are able to learn the location of the stimulus. And what's important is that we train these classifiers only on the first stimulus in a sequence. So the fully unpredictable, it would start whenever, wherever. So it's an unpredictable presentation. And what we then asked is these neural representations that we've now trained it on. So every millisecond since stimulus onset, when are these representations activated when they're just driven, or when they're driven by predictable stimuli? So when the stimulus is further down in the sequence, so just the motion can predict the location of the stimulus. So we looked at the first 4. So we had stimuli going on and on and on, which ended up being a slight waste of time because we only cared about the first 4 where we saw differences. So we look at all of these individually and see when are these neural representations activated in these stimuli. And what we found is that on the x-axis here, you see training time points. So that's the point in time. So when we train the classifier, so what we can basically look at that as increasing in neural representation. So 70 milliseconds is the earliest time point where there's information, and then it progresses to later time points. And on the y-axis, you see the latency of the peak performance. So how well, at what point does the classifier reach 80% of its peak? We picked 80 because it's just less noisy than the absolute peak, but we've done it across all thresholds, and there's no meaningful difference in the results. So what we see is that for the earliest training time point, so the earliest representations, there's no difference in latency regardless of the sequence position. So regardless if it's the first or the second or the third one in the sequence. So predictability doesn't modulate the latency there. But then from about 95 to 100 milliseconds, we see that the third and fourth stimulus are starting to peak earlier than the first one. So they're represented earlier than an unpredictable stimulus. And then from about 125 onwards, we see that also the second stimulus, the stimulus in the second sequence position has a latency advantage. And that's especially an interesting one that we didn't expect, because the second one isn't predictable yet. The first one can appear anywhere, and then the sequence can go clockwise or counterclockwise. So the second one isn't predictable yet. Only from the third one onwards, you have enough information to predict the location of the stimulus. But what has been found and what fits with this finding is that there's such a thing as an omni-directional within layer wave of subthreshold activity. So you can imagine this first stimulus is presented, and then within the layer, it can trigger this subthreshold wave of activity, reaching the receptive field of the second position. And then when the second position is presented, the time to peak is shorter. So you get this latency representation, this latency advantage for later representations. And then when the stimulus is fully predictable, so that's from sequence position 3 and onwards, and we see this additional latency advantage that can be explained by descending prediction. So we see these two kind of predictive mechanisms interact. So we see differences across neural representations and across sequence positions. And to then look, are there also downsides to having these predictions? Is there a difference in latency when these predictions are violated? We also had the stimulus reverse. So we had it going for at least 2 cycles, and then at a certain point, it will reverse directions. And then you have again these 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence position after the reversal. And what we find again is that from about 100 onwards, the third and fourth stimulus have a latency advantage of the first, but now also the second stimulus has an immediate latency advantage, which can be explained by the fact that there's just more information for the second one, since the reversal, the final one before the reversal, can add information to this motion trajectory. I don't need to go into this if we're running out of time, but what we also compared is then if a stimulus is unpredictable, so at the start of a sequence, or if it's violating a prediction, so that's the first one after reversal. And we find that indeed a prediction violation takes longer. If there's a latency disadvantage for a prediction violation compared to an unpredictable stimulus, and that's in the neural representation that's affected by these descending predictions. Yeah, so that's what's shown here. So there's a latency advantage when a stimulus violates a prediction. So yeah, that I want to thank my 2 supervisors, Stefan and Hinze. And then if there's any questions, I'd happily answer them.
Great talk, Tessel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I was wondering, is this decoding, is it done on the whole brain, or did you focus on visual areas?
No, we did the whole brain, yeah. So we just put in all we did the 64 channels of a 64 channel EEG, and all 64 4 channels went in, and the external ones. And so it's whole brain. And then presumably the only information difference would be in the visual cortex, but that's an assumption, and never really know if that comes true or not.
Hans, did you have a question? Or?
Yeah, if there are no questions from the audience, in several plots, I was wondering, you summarize everything by looking at this, how do you call it, latency of the peak performance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's only one way to characterize it, and I could imagine that there are certain aspects of the time course that you're losing or not characterizing by just the latency of the peak performance. I mean, is there anything that you might be missing there, or might you get a different picture if you look at something else, or is this the only thing you can do?
Well, the way we do it now is that we can look at, so we have this CAI, the peak performance. You can look at different time steps, right? So we look at 80% now, but the peak shows something different than if you look at 10%, for example, or 20, because you get the buildup. But they all showed fairly similar stuff. But what we also did with this paradigm in the past is that we looked at when we emit the stimulus at the end of a sequence, we can actually decode the anticipated location of it. So we actually also can look at the amplitude of the signal. But the amplitude differences are very small if the stimulus is actually presented. If the predictive mechanisms are negligible compared to the actual sensory signal.
Yeah, okay. Which by itself is also an interesting observation, I guess, right?
Yeah, that was the first step that we did. So we've published that beginning of this year. And this then the next, looking at the temporal domain.
Okay, thanks a lot.
So I was wondering if you think that, or if you've looked into whether these predictions would have an influence on behavior, like if they.
Yeah. So in the temporal domain, we haven't done that yet. But when I talked about the amplitude and how we kind of pre-activate this anticipated income, what we find, or what we're in the process of doing now, is looking at, okay, so can that pre-activation kind of bias perception when there's a very low low sensory information stimulus, so either very low luminance, low contrast, can actually this pre-activation of these neural representations, of these sensory representations, bias perception in that way. But that's still in the works.
Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Just a really technical question. Just the decoding approach, the way you do the pairwise decoding, is that standard, or is that because of your specific interest in the timing comparison?
I think that's more, I don't think it's very common, but I think it's very determined by this paradigm. Yeah. Because if you look at the sensory representations of the one that's here and the one that's there and there are going to be super similar. So trying to actually decode those is going to be very difficult. But if you then decode them all in pairwise, you get you average or you summate, whatever, that doesn't change much. You actually get a much more robust measure than just trying to decode two that are very similar. But I don't think it's very standard.
Okay, I think we have a question. Is this paradigm somehow showing something related to mental imagery?
Would it be related to mental imagery? I'm not completely sure. What has been done with a similar paradigm is where they have had this, it also comes out of Melbourne, where they have this stimulus go around and then they've stopped it and they've asked people to keep imagining it continuing without the actual stimulus being on the screen, and they're also able to decode the imagined location of the stimulus. So it's very cool. What I'm not doing much with mental imagery, but yeah, it's a pretty powerful paradigm in that sense, because obviously when you're trying to decode in the visual cortex, position is such a strong difference between electrodes. So it's a pretty powerful paradigm in that sense.
Great.